Welcome to part 2 of the East Bay Leadership Series, a program featuring land use experts and major East Bay employers who will discuss what we call the Bay Area paradox. You can work here, but you just can't afford to live here. My name is Kristen Connolly. I'm the president and CEO of the East Bay Leadership Council, an employer-led advocacy organization with hundreds of members, employers of all sizes in Contra Costa and Alameda County. Our mission is to promote public policies that promote and improve economic vitality and quality of life. We're in for a very timely and terrific program today. And working on housing in the East Bay is definitely one of our policy priorities. So I'm very excited. So without question, everyone in this room understands the importance of strong board leadership. And since July of last year, the East Bay Leadership Council has benefited from just an extraordinary leader at the helm with Andrew Saby in his role as board chair. And for months, Andrew and I have been talking about the importance of focusing on housing and focusing on the housing crisis. He has particular expertise in this area, and we're really thrilled that he's serving as our moderator today. And while many of you know Andrew from his many years of involvement with the council, I'm very pleased to properly introduce him to you as a subject matter expert and moderator. Usually I just say, hey, Andrew, take it away. Project applicants, landowners, and public agencies turn to Andrew to resolve disputes arising out of the land use entitlement and permitting process. He has successfully resolved numerous cases involving the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, Planning and Zoning Law, Subdivision Map Act, Development Agreement Law, and related proceedings, as well as claims involving water law, ballot box planning, and due process. Andrew handles federal claims under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, and the Endangered Species Act, including projects proceeding under joint state and federal permitting procedures. He handles lots and lots of complicated things. He represents clients across a broad spectrum of commercial litigation matters related to real property, contracts, construction management, and prevailing wage issues. Regularly appearing in state appellate courts throughout California, Andrew has also handled litigation matters before the California Supreme Court, as well as the federal district courts and the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Andrew grew up in Massachusetts and earned his bachelor's from St. Lawrence University before heading west to attend law school at UC Davis. And aren't we glad he did? Andrew lives in Lafayette with his wife, Erin, and their 2 children. I would now like to welcome to the stage the 2015-16 chair of the East Bay Leadership Council and a partner at Cox Castle Nicholson, Andrew Saby. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everyone, for attending this afternoon. It is indeed a very timely issue and one that has bedeviled us all for many years. So I'm really looking forward to solutions today, which may be elusive if history is any guide. But I did want to take a moment to acknowledge the East Bay Leadership Council's role and the satisfaction I've taken from being the chair this last year, the ability of this council to influence and advocate for policy change and for advancing issues that really will contribute to the quality of life and economic vitality, I think is just growing by the day. It's growing through the leadership of our staff and Kristen, and it's really the strength of our membership and our board. 70 members on this board, which is a little bit unwieldy. Kind of makes me think city councils are a little bit easier to deal with sometimes than our board. But it's a tremendous group of people, and if I could just ask, Kristen did a lot of stand and be acknowledged earlier, but if I could just ask all the members of the East Bay Leadership Council Board of Directors who are present today to just stand for a round of applause. Thank you. Thank you. All right. I want to make a couple of brief remarks before I invite our speakers up. I did want to frame the issue that we're going to be talking about today. The notion of the Bay Area paradox, I think, it really is pretty amazing when you stop and think about the engine of the Bay Area job creation is just amazing. It is almost unstoppable. And when you look at some of the statistics, and I'm sorry that Lisa Vorderbruggen's not here. She's here? Oh, Hi, Lisa. Thank you. She provided some stats that I've seen now kind of evolving over the last few years that just keep getting more and more unbelievable. Experts would tell you that you need about 1.5 jobs per house, or you need a house for every job and a half, and if in order to maintain balance out there. And so in the last 5 years in the Bay Area, we've created 530,000 new jobs. Yay us. And 90,000 new housing units. I mean, it's that bad, and it's just that trajectory is just going in the wrong direction, and it continues to get worse. So we're really good at job creation, and we're just really bad at housing production. And it's interesting to me, you cannot solve a problem until you recognize you have a problem, right? The first step in problem solution is recognizing you have a problem. And I want to read something. I don't normally think that reading things up here is very good theater, but this, I want to read this because I just think it's so interesting. You're going to think that I wrote this. You're going to think that this is sort of the opening lines of a brief that I wrote defending some housing proposal. So bear with me for a moment. Consider whether or not this is a diagnosis of our problem. The lack of housing is a critical problem that threatens the economic, environmental, and social quality of life in California. California housing has become the most expensive in the nation. The excessive cost of the state's housing supply is partially caused by activities and policies of many local governments that limit the approval of housing, increase the cost of land for housing, and require that high fees and exactions be paid by the producers of housing. Among the consequences of those actions are discrimination against low-income and minority households, lack of housing to support employment growth, imbalance in the jobs and housing, reduced mobility, urban sprawl, excessive commuting, and air quality deterioration. Many local governments do not give adequate attention to the economic, environmental, and social costs of decisions that result in disapproval of housing projects, reduction in density of housing projects, and excessive standards for housing projects. Now, does that sound like a rant or a screed from BIA or some beleaguered home builder who's just gotten through their last, remand from a city council? That is the words of your esteemed California legislature ensconced in the government code. I just read you the preliminary language out of the planning and zoning law. That is our state law. That is our legislature. They have identified the problem. So, why haven't we solved it yet? I guess I shouldn't overpromise and underdeliver, but that is the goal, at least. We're going to try to frame that for you today and see if we can't help at least this group continue to advocate effectively for ways to solve that. I don't want to put too much pressure on Jennifer and Denise, but those of you that were at the installation dinner last week heard me extol the virtues of this program and promise solutions, so we'll see how we do. All right, so I would like to introduce our panel of really some great expertise that we've assembled here today that I think will give a great insight into some of the things that are out there, really help you understand the degree of this problem, as well as, I think, lead to a discussion that can be more productive. And the first person I would like to introduce is Jennifer Hernandez. Jennifer is a partner at the law firm of Holland and Knight, co-chairs their national team, their environmental team, and leads the West Coast Land Use and Environmental Practice Group. She works on projects across the state and has achieved national prominence in her work on brownfields development, wetlands, endangered species, and master plan communities. There's a lot in here about her, but I will just tell you that the other thing about Jennifer is that she is just a tireless, selfless advocate for trying to figure out how to make California's land use laws work for home building and development in a responsible way. She is both an advocate for sustainable development and environmental conscience, and one who I think has really tried to find ways to bridge the gap in Sacramento. So she's doing a lot of the hard work out there, and I would say selflessly, because I know as a lawyer who has to bill his time, this takes a lot of time, and she has donated an inordinate amount of time to this issue and is really a treasured expert on this. And I will say, as I invite Jennifer up, a fun fact that the staff found is that Mayor Willie Brown proclaimed October 9, 2002 as Jennifer Hernandez Day in San Francisco for her work on sustainable land use. So that's a pretty good honor. Come on up, Jennifer. Next, I'd like to introduce our own Sharon Jenkins, the Director of Corporate and Employer Health at John Muir Health. Sharon also serves as on the Executive Committee of the East Bay Leadership Council and the VP of Economic Development and Jobs. Sharon has been with John Muir Health for more than 20 years, giving her a unique perspective on how healthcare industry workforce and hiring needs have evolved and the challenges, I think, that healthcare and other major employers in the Greater Bay and in the East Bay in particular, the challenges they face in recruiting, retaining the workers that are needed for all these jobs that we keep generating. Sharon earned her Bachelor of Science degree in Community Health and Education from CSU Long Beach and a Master's from CSU East Bay. She is a graduate of the Leadership Contra Costa program. She is an active member of a lot of the local chambers of commerce. Like Jennifer, which I neglected to say, she is an East Bay native, and her roots in this area go back for generations, which I think also offers an interesting perspective for those of us who are East Coast carpetbaggers, who came here later after school. So in her role at John Muir and as a leader on the council, she's really become someone who can appreciate the difficulties that this region's major employers have in hiring. So I think she's going to offer a really interesting perspective as someone who's not an expert on housing per se, but has experienced the challenges that the folks face who are trying to hire. So please come on up, Sharon. Thank you. And last but not least, we're very pleased to welcome Denise Pinkston. Denise is a partner at a group called TMG Partners. She also serves as the housing chair for our colleagues over at the Bay Area Council. Denise has over 30 years of experience in real estate, including acquisitions, asset and construction management, marketing, leasing, planning, entitlements, transit, green building, public affairs. I know that she was named one of the Bay Area's most influential women in Bay Area business by the Biz Times in 2012, 2013, and I did see this recently, 2016. Congratulations. She is named a Forever Influential Honor Roll in 2014. She teaches at the Lori Loki Graduate School of Business at Mills College. And she's also served in government. So prior to being at TMG, she was the Current Planning, Code Enforcement, Housing and Redevelopment. Wow, that's a mouthful. Current Enforcement, Housing and Redevelopment in Marin County Planning Service Coordinator, Planning Commissioner, and I have personal experience with that. She currently serves as the chair of the Zoning Adjustments Board in the city of Berkeley and was there late last night. So please join me in welcoming Denise Pinkston to round out our panel. Thank you all. So the way we envision this is, I think both Denise and then Jennifer have a slideshow and some prepared remarks, I think, to frame and educate everybody in the room so that you can get a taste in a little bit more depth than I was able to offer of the issues. And then we're going to open it up to Sharon for some remarks after that, and then we will encourage questions to be posted on those very cute little note cards at your table. So, and if I like the question and we have time, I will pose it. If I don't like the question, I have a little slot up here for it. So, all right. So, without further ado, Denise, if you would like, I don't know if you want to stand up if you can see it. I may need to do the same.
Hoping my slides show up somewhere. Are there slides? Well, in any case, while the slides are coming, is someone working on the AV?
Coming.
There we go. All right. So my CEO of our development company, Michael Covarrubias, is now the head of the Bay Area Council, the president of the council. We serve in a voluntary capacity like many of your officials do. When I was asked, Michael basically said, okay, I'm the head of the council for 2 years. There is a massive crisis of transportation, of housing, of affordability. If we're going to put in a lot of volunteer hours, I want to make a difference. So go fix that housing problem, Denise. And yeah, that's kind of what I did. I laughed and said, well, okay, let's figure out what we might be able to do that would make a difference. And I have this slideshow, which they will work on. Well, while we're waiting, because I don't want to waste my public theater moment, the first policy, you know, when you start with a problem, you try and figure out what the problem is, and then are there any policy interventions that could make any difference? So I think Andrew did a fair job of summarizing the nature of the housing crisis. Underlying it is a huge imbalance between jobs and housing supply, which we at the council see all the time. All of our major employers, just like your employers, have identified housing as the #1 problem that is limiting their ability to hire, retain employees, to keep their employees that they have that they're managing to hang on to happy and preserve their quality of life. Our healthcare providers are finding that by having someone in their car an hour to 2 hours each way commuting to work, not only are they unable to hire people to run their companies, but they're unable to provide good health outcomes for those individuals and for their families, because who can be healthy if you sit in your car for 3 or 4 hours a day? The question is, well, let's talk about their problem. Why aren't we building enough? And I think we have to go back to when I was in high school, and one of my high school classmates is here, when Prop 13 was adopted. At that moment in time, and it was, you know, a period of time in the 70s when a lot of big policy ideas came forward to make California the best place possible, including strong environmental laws, changes to the tax code, and I think we're witnessing all these many years later some of the unintended outcomes of those policies. So Prop 13 has created an institutional bias against building housing. Those of you who are public officials know if you look at your balance sheet and you're trying to figure out, sorry, this is a little loud and I talk loud. If you're trying to figure out if you want to build a mall or an office complex versus a housing complex, you're better off creating the jobs. That's why we have a jobs imbalance. It's not that jobs are somehow magically better, it's that they pay the bills for local government and housing does not. So we have a Prop 13 institutionalized bias against building housing for many cities. Also, a lot of infill sites, as you all know, are incredibly unpopular. Many of them are on the edge of neighborhoods where neighbors get very upset because their daily living experience in their neighborhoods will be changed if there is dense infill projects that come toward them. And costs are rising significantly. So I like this photo. You know, I voted for Prop 13, and now my house is worth 10 times as much as my neighbors, and you know, and they pay that much more in property tax. A lot of folks have no incentive as to themselves to change the rules in their neighborhoods, and they don't have much of an incentive to encourage neighborhood modification. Everyone cleared out up here, I hope. I have a nice routine that I do just to show people what infill means. Hi. Hi. I'm going to be infill. That's infill. We get closer, and it's a little uncomfortable, and it's a little weird. And that's why people don't like it. And so next slide. That's why we don't have enough of it. It's a very human thing. So what happens when infill means getting close, getting a little uncomfortable, and we have this bias? The zoning institutions that we have create a kind of entrenched systemic tool that encourages discrimination and exclusion. And it's not just in California. They're actually finding nationally in the White House, the Office of Economic Advisors has identified exclusionary zoning as a #1 cause of inequity, racial inequity, poverty, and even declined national productivity. The inability of people in the population to freely move to be near job centers, to be near good schools for their kids, and the lack of housing in those good places for their families is depressing the national economy. Next slide. So as Andrew mentioned, the Legislative Analyst's Office in the state of California has clearly documented that California has produced less housing than anywhere else in the country over a very long period of time. Next slide. And we have a huge ongoing cumulative unmet housing need. These last two arrows show the unmet housing need in San Francisco, which other than during the recession years has been growing enormously since we've been creating jobs. Next slide. This just shows the pricing result of unmet demand. San Francisco's at the top. our competitive cities and other parts of the country have a much more affordable level of housing, and many California companies are dealing with the housing problem by leaving the state or moving out whole business units to other parts of the US because that's where their employees are able to live. Next slide. So what happens when there's no housing for middle-income workforce? They leave. These are the states where California is sending its workforce, primarily Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, which don't really share our greenhouse gas climate change priorities in terms of their land use patterns. So we talk a good game in California about urban infill and density and adding housing near transit, and yet the end result of that is we're shipping out our folks to Texas. Next slide. Where else are they going? They're going to exurbia. They're going to the very farmlands in California that our state planning policies have pledged to protect from development incursion. So this is the traffic jam from Central Valley coming out over the Altamont Pass, and the new affordable Bay Area suburbs are Tracy, Stockton, and Lathrop, where you get 2 hours each way to get to your job. And every company has someone who's stuck in that commute. I have a friend who works for the Exploratorium. They have someone who lives in Lodi and commutes to Lodi every day. There are people called temporary homeless, next slide, who can literally have no home near their job, so they live in their truck during the week, or maybe in the company parking lot full time until they manage to save enough money to rent or buy an apartment. We also have engineers in the Bay Area. These are actual photos of Google employees and places in the Silicon Valley where employees can't find housing, so they're living out of their trucks and parking lots. And this is an affordable unit in San Francisco that somebody designed as a box that they put in the dining room of their friend, and they rent it for $400 a month. So we push the population to sort of absurd extremes. Next slide. And a lot of people are worried that this is really going to mean the end of the Golden State for many people, certainly for middle-class people, where you have a kind of barbell economy where you have very low-wage employees who are stuck in a hellacious commute, and folks who can afford to buy high-end housing in desirable communities who can afford to remain here. Bay Area Council recently did a survey and found that 1/3 of Bay Area residents hope they can leave soon. That's a sobering statistic. Next slide. So the economic effects, as predicted by the federal government, of not having enough housing are significant. Next slide. What can we do? We have to change the rules to change the outcomes. We've got to change the rules that limit housing production. Next slide. So what can cities in the state do to help change the rules to make more housing possible and maintain California as a place where middle-income workforce folks can continue to live? First of all, to change the zoning and the processing communities to allow more effective construction types with little delay. Encourage lower cost construction type, wood frame, second units, things that don't have to be sold for as much money. Eliminate fiscal barriers to housing and take a look at how to level the tax playing field. So it may mean we get into things like Prop 13 reform or sharing sales taxes, so there's no longer a disincentive or a powerful incentive to do retail and not to do housing. And to reward cities that build housing, but also hold them accountable. We have requirements in the state or planning guidelines that say everyone has to plan for enough housing, but no one actually has to build the housing that they plan for. So it allows there to be this big disconnect between what people need to do and what they actually do. Jennifer will talk about CEQA abuse, and we need more state money for housing. When redevelopment was eliminated, they're a huge source of funds for deed-restricted affordable housing was eliminated, and until we get some of that money back, it'll be very hard to produce housing for lower income and even lower middle income families. So in this context, we can talk about, so this was my spiel until like 3 weeks ago when the governor put in his budget the idea of by right zoning. Most people who work in housing were speechless. They had no idea that this was even a twinkle in his eye. And yet, remember, this is the governor who eliminated redevelopment. So to underestimate the resolve of Jerry Brown to fix a problem once he's got it in his sights, I think is a mistake. And so now there's this huge debate going on about whether and how to increase funding for affordable housing and tie it to land use regulation reform that would allow housing, after it's been planned and zoned and CEQA review is done, to actually get built. Next slide. Another policy area which the Bay Area Council is working on, we call it invisible density, is to promote more second unit adoption in more communities. And we have partners that we're doing this work with that are nonprofits that are infill oriented. And for those of you, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly here, but essentially second units are allowing homeowners who may want to share a portion of their existing property, maybe within the four walls of their home or their garage, which they can usually already remodel. There's the man cave, the yoga studio, the home office, the teenage party pad. Well, let them to remodel those buildings on a building permit and let somebody live there. Let them share that space with a grandparent or a family member or a teacher in the community who otherwise would be unable to live there. And in communities that have really streamlined the rules for accessory dwelling units, the city of Vancouver being a good example, they're adding 1,000 of these a year. It is just as important a source of affordable housing in Vancouver now as typical market rate big buildings. Next slide. To encourage more ADUs, there are a number of things you can do. We can go into this in detail if there are questions, so I'm going to skip that and go to the next slide. And just let you know that in this vein, the Bay Area Council has sponsored a bill which is being carried by Senator Wachowski to slightly modify state law to encourage more second units by reducing fees that are charged for hooking up second units to utilities, by reducing parking requirements near transit, and by allowing existing structures to be converted to rental space on a building permit. And we have many, many sponsors and endorsers in this effort from all over the political field. And this is the notion I want to leave you with. Housing is no longer a housing policy advocate issue. It is everyone in this room's issue. If you have a company or you have a kid who can't come back from college because they can't live in the community, or your kids go to school and your teachers can't live there, we need to work on this problem together with all of these kinds of solutions. And so when we sponsored the Wachowski bill, we went to everybody and asked for their support. The State Chamber of Commerce, the Building Industry Association, NRDC, the Greenbelt Alliance. So we've got business, environmental, we have housing advocates, we have CEOs. And I think that is the model for the housing policy wave in this next period, is for all of us to start talking about something that's not our core business model. Second units are not my core business. I don't build them, I don't have one. But it should be something all of us want to see more of. And we all are going to need more housing. So that's kind of I think that's the last slide.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Denise. And so Denise ended on an optimistic note with some ideas for solutions, and I apologize in advance that Jennifer's going to take us back into a less optimistic discussion. But it's a discussion, it's like the bitter pill you need to take, and then we can talk about some positive developments.
So I have a three-part presentation. The first is just kind of a little bit biographical, and it'll put the rest of it, I hope, in context and give people time to put the slideshow up. The second is a set of statistics about what CEQA litigation actually does in California. The California Environmental Quality Act has been this kind of third rail issue because many of us, I guess maybe all of us, are pretty protective of the environment. CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is associated with protecting the environment, and no one really wants to not protect the environment. And so we have as a philosophy major, semantic issue with even talking about, weakening CEQA, weakening environmental protection. Not the case, as the slides will show. And then finally, I end with 3 reform proposals for CEQA, which really have, I think, changed the nature of the dialogue in Sacramento. Haven't changed the politics, but we're hammering away at the politics, and it's going to be a hard fight. So first, biography. This is where I got married in Yosemite, 1989, right after the earthquake. So I grew up in Pittsburgh, California, which all of you know. One of the few groups that I can actually say, you guys all know Pittsburgh. Oh, thanks. My Mexican grandfather and his brothers were recruited from the field in near Fresno, where I was yesterday. They were hellacious basketball players, or baseball players, and U.S. Steel had just opened and was looking for both laborers they can train and baseball players to beat Dow Chemical and Union Carbide and stuff like that. And so my grandfather's generation came to the mill, and my dad worked at the mill from high school on. My German grandfather was the second son of a farmer in Lodi, and during the Depression hit the rails and then also ended up as a machinist at the steel mill. So we were a steel mill AFL-CIO family. I grew up there. It was a mixed bag, I have to say. In the 60s, Pittsburgh had moments of great odor. We learned to sail in the Pittsburgh Yacht Harbor, where I was a Sea Scout of all things, and I just thought all water had a rainbow. It was very colorful. We all had mysterious rashes and had endless shots for allergies and whatnot. And I grew up to be pretty passionate about the environment. As a senior in high school, I won what I consider to be sort of our national lottery. I got a full ride scholarship to Harvard, including winter clothes and plane tickets, which was pretty incredible because otherwise I was heading to Los Medanos. And 4 years later, I got a similar opportunity to attend Stanford Law School. 7 years after leaving Pittsburgh, I was working at a large law firm. What time are we supposed to go to the bathroom? You know, I'd only worked flipping burgers before then. So it was a little bit of a cultural adjustment, but it was still incredible. And I was doing environmental law, which is what I was passionate about. And I thought I would do environmental law and then sort of, you know, work for the government or something, but learn in a private sector environment. And in March of my first year as a lawyer, queen of the universe that I was, I got a call. My dad, who was then 55, it's about how old I am now, was permanently laid off. And within 3 years, Pittsburgh as I knew it ended. There were shutdowns, curtailments, acquisitions, union jobs were lost by the thousands. And what had been a working town, and in my experience, sort of a, quote, middle-class existence, right? We had our house, we had medical, they sent us to Catholic school, God help the nuns. My brother went from De La Salle to welding school. I went to Crondelet, oh, God help those nuns. But that was a very, really unbelievable experience. My parents persevered. When you lose your job in your 50s, you tend not to recover, you survive. And he was a retail clerk at Osh Hardware until he retired. It was a fall from the middle class. And we managed to eke my little sister through St. Mary's. And I sort of switched gears. And I remember going to Marin, where I had never spent much time, to this eco store, and every single thing in that store in the 80s had been manufactured in China. And I'm like, California has among the strongest labor standards in the world. We have among the strongest environmental standards in the world. Why isn't it part of our environmental ethic to keep those jobs here? Why not? And my practice evolved into really representing both public sector and private sector clients who were looking to grow or expand here, or sometimes just stay in business. When this last recession hit, 30 years now into my practice, I knew what was going to happen. I knew that more people would lose jobs, and some of those people would be my relatives again, because I'd seen it happen in 2 prior recessions. But this time, I was in my 50s, and I knew people. I had spent 20 years on the California League of Conservation Voters Board. I am a supporter of the environment. I met with the chair of CLCV, which is one of the major environmental organizations in the state that lobbies on this stuff. And the chair at the time was Tom Adams, who was from Adams and Broadwell, who pioneered the use of CEQA by unions against whatever the unions wanted to leverage an agreement for wages about. And we had just enacted SB 375, which was this vision for higher density transit-oriented development, and the environmental community and the development community were in this kumbaya moment. And the recession hit, and I took Tom to a meal in Burlingame on a rainy day, and I said, Tom, we are going to lose it again, right? People are going to be out of their homes. It's bad. It's bad. But Silicon Valley's still pumping jobs. Entertainment industry is still pumping jobs, but I don't care about them. Can't we just do a pilot project, 3 years, rest of Jerry Brown's first term, where we do CEQA? Fine. But for multifamily housing along transit, you can't sue and stop a project. You can sue a project, you can make them do more mitigation, but you can't sue and stop. Let's get the jobs going, let's get the housing we know we need going. It's one of the few bright spots in the whole globe. And we can keep my family, which is still in the trades, working. And Tom looked at me and he said, Jennifer, that will never happen. And he walked out. And it was like a moment from Casablanca, you know. I'm like, no, I'm supposed to be walking out, you know. Had this fedora on, and I'm like, oh my God, what's going on? And at that moment, in 2009, something I knew was going on at a much deeper level with CEQA than I had previously understood, working at a project-by-project basis. So I determined to find out. I'm very irritating that way, and stubborn. This is one slide that tells you all you need to know about CEQA and why it is such a unique problem for California. There is no other environmental law in the nation that allows you to sue anonymously. This one does. Any reason, even no reason at all. Lawyers don't even need clients to sue. Courts are very active in shaping what CEQA requires. If any of you are a lawyer, related to a lawyer, God forbid married to a lawyer, even know a lawyer, you will not identify us as a profession as an agreeable group of individuals. We are cranky and critical. We like second guessing. Judges second guess. And CEQA requires you to get about 100 questions right. And if you get half of one wrong, there was a high-rise project in San Francisco where a judge decided several years after the fact that they should have done a new count at one intersection. If you get anything wrong, the most common remedy is to vacate project approvals and start anew. There's a high-rise in LA that was constructed and had tenants. A late breaking because we had judicial budget cutbacks. CEQA lawsuit decision came out, ruled against the project. They lost their certificate of occupancy. No financing, no insurance, tenants escorted out. It remains empty, waiting for another round of CEQA studies. These are all told in a book, that book, that's online. You can print it out or you can buy a copy, but I would encourage you to do the free print online thing. Everything I say is in that book. So now, CEQA's a problem. Oh, one last point, of course. It's really easy to win CEQA lawsuits. Compared to other lawsuits against government agencies, about half the time, agencies lose in a 15-year study of reported appellate cases, about 46%. Think about what our tax system would be like if you can sue the IRS with nearly even odds of not having to pay. Think about the predictability of our revenue scheme. And yet that's what CEQA is, and that's why it's so powerful. Because with these odds and vacate project approval as an outcome, that's more likely than not, no one in their right mind puts money on the table to fund a project, right? You can't get a construction loan, you can't get a grant. So the act of suing stops a project cold. $1,000 or so to sue, anonymously, any purpose. Nothing else like it in the country, not even close. So we looked at all CEQA lawsuits filed between 2010 and 2012 statewide, 613 CEQA lawsuits during what was still a recessionary period. We're updating this and there's more lawsuits filed now. Big political points. CEQA's about business versus the enviros. No. Half of CEQA lawsuits involve no private applicant at all. This is the business of government. This is running schools and parks. This is retrofitting with LED lighting high schools. Because during this period, we had federal stimulus funding that were going around and funding that kind of stuff, and neighbors sued. The yellow are construction projects challenged under CEQA in existing cities or in unincorporated counties 100% surrounded by development at the site level, think Bay Point or Rodeo. 80% of CEQA lawsuits are filed inside existing communities. We use this not to protect the pristine environment or to prevent sprawl. The vast majority of these cases, over 90% in LA in our next study, are just neighbor-on-neighbor disputes or fights that have maybe nothing to do with CEQA or with the environment. Of the infill projects in existing cities, just a few more, percentage-wise, are about public services and infrastructure, and the next biggest target is residential. If this doesn't work, who the heck wants these? Of the residential challenges, the absolute top target are exactly the form of, quote, environmental product that we're trying to encourage, multifamily attached product. This was surprising to me. 17% of these CEQA lawsuits are true neighbor-on-neighbor disputes over single-family homes or the addition of a second unit. CEQA is a NIMBY tool. But it's not just a NIMBY tool. We took every plaintiff's name in that 613 case study and ran it through Google, because we're a law firm and we can do that, to find out if that name had any prior track record of environmental advocacy. Obviously, the Sierra Club does. Various local groups or smaller groups do. Almost half had no prior existence. Only 13% of CEQA lawsuits were filed by recognized environmental advocacy groups of any kind. The environmental community advocacy world is vehement about CEQA. But that has a heck of a lot more to do with the political alliance between building trades and the environmental community than about real enviros. And it has a heck of a lot more to do with individual members and donors to the environmental community defining the environment as their own backyard. Okay, I'm a trade gal, AFL-CIO. If this is really the union tool that it now is clear to me it is, and it was working, hey, I did this for free, I didn't need to publish it. So I looked, with the help of one of my co-authors who's got this handy PhD thing. Building trades have taken it in the teeth, as have many unions during the last 20 years. This is a slide that shows nationally half as many building trade workers are union as they were in 1983. Half of those jobs are no longer union that once were in the United States. In other blue states, you would expect, and it is indeed the case, unions have held on to more jobs than the national average. California has done worse with our near supermajority of Dems in Congress, with our incredible power, with teachers' unions, nurses' unions, firemen, police, unable to afford housing. We have given building trades a lock on CEQA. And I'm sorry, that doesn't work for me. My brother had to move to Chico because that commute between Oakley and Oakland was killing him. He's a welder. Chico to San Francisco every week. Really? Yep. He's now 54 or something, a couple more years to retirement. CEQA happens everywhere. This is a distribution of CEQA lawsuits throughout the state, but it mostly happens where people live. It's not about the pristine environment. Lawyers will say, consultants will say, just do an EIR. Do an EIR, you'll be okay. Actually, if you do a full-blown EIR, you're much, much, much more likely to be sued, and you're much more likely to lose that lawsuit. Only 43% of challenged EIRs survive appeal. 56% of neg decs fail. Categorical exemptions are good if you can find one that fits. And there are other tools Now, this is tricks of the trade, right? Addendums and tiered documents off the sustainable community strategy. There's things you can do that are not on this chart. That's why they pay me the big bucks. So to conclude, public services and infrastructure, agency plans and regs are the most frequent targets of CEQA lawsuits. And during the study period, the #1 infrastructure target of CEQA lawsuits was transit. #1 industrial manufacturing. Oh, there was no manufacturing activity permitted during that period, as best as we can tell. But of what's left, utility, renewable energy, most frequent target of CEQA lawsuits. And for housing, it was multifamily, transit-oriented. Really? Really, these are like the Walmart lawsuits that are also union disputes. This is a mixed bag, but it's a mess. This is not a way to create housing for people. It's certainly not about the environment. So, you know, what do we say about it? Well, we said various things. I wrote a whole book. It took a lot of wine. The governor has called CEQA reform the Lord's work, has also noted, you know, Lord's work doesn't get done all the time. CEQA's like a vampire unless you strike to put a silver straight. These are his words, right? It's fabulous, you know? So you shouldn't decide, see, they told the Supreme Court they shouldn't get into an aesthetics case about an infill project because, you know, some people like to live close together. It's just not an issue that judges should decide. And then he sort of took a powder until this crazy by right proposal, which kind of exempts housing from CEQA, but we won't get there. Anyway, I actually like CEQA. My license plate is CEQA nerd. I think it does a great job in making people accountable and actually think hard about the environment, but this litigation abuse stuff has to end. So we proposed 3 reforms, all of which have seen some level now of Sacramento adventurizing. The first was require transparency in who's suing. The whole thing's about transparency and disclosure. Why do you get to hide when you sue? You actually, under court rules, have to say who you are and who's paying you if you do an amicus letter or if you seek attorney's fees. So we're just moving the disclosure up. This made it into print for the first time this year and made it to 2 policy committees for the first time this year and was voted down on party lines for the first time this year, where the Democratic majority, I'm a Democrat, had to say, yeah, no, I guess I'm not for disclosure after all. And the union representative from Building Trades, Cesar, said, this would fundamentally change CEQA. And the chair said, yeah, it might, and voted against it. But the jig is up. The jig is up with CEQA. So I guess we can now whittle away at it, but whittle away at it not from the perspective of we're trying to destroy the environment, but really trying to take away this abuse of what I think is a great California legal tool. And duplicative lawsuits. We have 2 projects in LA have been sued more than 30 times over 10 years, or over 20 years. You can sue every single time there's a new discretionary decision by an agency. And you can sue multiple agencies. The city can approve it. Caltrans makes an improvement. You can sue against them. We think you should be able to sue once. And after that, we need the stability to implement long-term plans. There's a 5-page story of the effort of Hollywood to do higher density transit. And it's a story of 13 sequential EIRs over 30 years. Average duration now to deliver a transportation project in California is more than 20 years, and it involves 2 CEQA lawsuits, not concurrent. Fix it, don't derail it. There is no other law, again, in the country that lets you just whack a democratically approved project because you file a piece of paper with a $1,000 check that stops funding. So really the presumption, and the Supreme Court has actually made room for this, the presumption should be that you should fix a study. But unless the project involves environmental harm, public health harm, enough already. These are housing projects, park projects. We may disagree about them, but they are not harming people or the environment. In fact, quite the contrary, they're necessary for people and the environment. So you should fix it, not derail it. That's my last point, is this law is actually working great for people my age. You know, it works great to just freeze what we have and to keep those out who don't already have. And that has consequences to economics, to race, to age, that if this wasn't called an environmental law, we would have blown this up in this state decades ago. This is discrimination, and it needs to end. So let's shine some light on it. These are reasonable reforms. No one's talking exemptions or repeal or anything, but enough already with the litigation abuse. And we'll keep at it.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I would invite you all to, Denise and Jennifer, to come back up. Sharon, I know, has a few. Sharon, please come on up. Doesn't have a slideshow, so that we'll just would love to hear your perspective as someone who's not steeped in this, but still faces everything that Denise and Jennifer just talked about.
I think I have the solution, and this is a local plug, because my family, too, worked in the paper mills over in Pittsburgh, so local family. And then I would, as a local girl and part of the Concord Chamber of Commerce, I would say Concord High has all your solutions, because the engineering program there is building tiny houses. But yes, as one of the largest employers in Contra Costa County, my role at John Muir Health is to work with employers. Employers are where you choose your health care, and employers are also where you retire from, which I didn't hear either of you or anyone else today kind of speaking about retirees and seniors, and how getting to 100 is like kind of a piece of cake at this point. I mean, getting to 100 years old, if you're talking about, all of these seniors that are going to need housing as well, that's certainly a focus at John Muir Health from a healthcare perspective. We're thinking about our senior patients. So what I would say is my role at the hospital, dealing with HR and benefit folks, and certainly all of the wonderful requirements and regulations that those people have to deal with on a regular basis. And my role in dealing with those employers is obviously the health of their employees. And certainly what I hear, and you mentioned it earlier, we go in and provide health promotion services. If an employer is healthier in their employee health population, it reduces the cost, right? Their healthcare expenses are lower. So my team is in, many local employers in this region, and I love that I sit down and I take someone's blood pressure. I'll just cut straight to it. I take to someone's blood pressure, and it's screamingly high, and I say, oh goodness, what's going on? Well, this or that, and I start to talk about it with them, and I say, what's happening? And they go, well, I, have a 2-hour commute every single day, and, and I'm like, yikes. How am I even going to begin this conversation on how to improve this person's health? Because I know by the time they get home after working, they're completely exhausted, they're going through the drive-through, and when they walk in the door, they're eating, they're squatting, they're gobbling, and they're going to bed. And so here is my role. My obligation to this employer is trying to improve the health of their employee population, and I know, oh my gosh, this person's commuting this entire way. And I think the flip side of it is how many of you as employers are ready for that employee to walk in your door after a 2-hour commute and expect 100% productivity, right? You're not going to get it. So certainly that is our role. John Muir Health, fortunately at this time, because we're a large regional employer, we're circling the mountain as far as facilities and offerings have for our own employees. We don't have as much of the transit and the issues that some of the rest of the folks are facing. But your Chico to San Francisco, that definitely tops. The only thing I've heard as far as the commute, I think the worst has been from the Central Valley to San Francisco. I hear a lot of that. And I think from a health perspective as well, we need our patients to have access and transportation and to get to our facilities, and that's going to affect the health. And that's a healthcare provider. It's not a John Muir thing. We want our patients to be healthy, and so to be able to have, affordable housing, access to public transit, so that they can have improved health care. That's something that I think all of us in the healthcare industry are looking for. How's that?
Thank you very much, Sharon. I mean, it is it's real. It's real life, and it's this area in particular we're sort of on the doorstep as it just gets worse as you go west from here. I mean, a lot of people in San Francisco and Silicon Valley consider this the outlying area. And yet there are still 100 miles east of here where people are attempting to penetrate this area to reach the jobs that are so attractive. You know, I'm curious, there's a couple of questions in here about the governor's new proposal, and I know, Jennifer, you've been tracking that to a certain degree. I know BIA has been watching it. Lots of people are watching it. But I wonder if you could just, you know, we didn't have too much time to talk about it, kind of what it is and kind of where it fits in the state policy, and just kind of maybe even handicap it if you're capable of doing that. I know that's tricky right now.
Sure. So the proposal was to require cities that have zoned multifamily duplex on up with no high limit on infill sites, which are defined as locations within a city that are surrounded 75% by other development, more or less, to issue housing permits for such attached projects within, I think it was initially 120 days, 90 days, by ministerial permit, which means no planning commission, city council, or CEQA, in order to do a lot of housing, with the proviso that if you were in a transit-served area, you had to have a designated amount of affordable housing, and if you were not in a transit priority area, you had to have a higher percentage of affordable housing, 10% and 20% respectively. And the governor's budget statement is very powerful and makes the case that we are spending in San Francisco $579,000 per door to build one affordable unit. And even in Contra Costa, we're north of $300,000 per door. These are multifamily apartment-type subsidized housing units. And that we cannot spend our way out of the problem. The need is too great. Even $1 billion, which the Assembly was asking for, wouldn't make a dent, and frankly, a lot of it would get spent on people like me and consultants and others who spend years and whittle down projects and then ultimately may sue and stop them. So the governor said the paradigm has to change, and so having taken away redevelopment, having vetoed last year's widely supported permanent source of funding for affordable housing, he said, I will do housing funding this year, but only if it's coupled with this regulatory reform. And that came as a complete surprise on all sides of the aisle. I think the most amazing thing to me and the most distressing thing and among the most immoral things I've ever confronted in my legal career was the headline the next day in the LA Times, which said, building trades environmentalists are strongest opponents of governor's affordable housing proposal. And that's true. Within 24 hours, almost all environmental organizations and a lot of the trades, including the trades that needed this housing, or a lot of the unions that needed this housing, signed a letter telling the governor to not do it. It has not moved. Yesterday's budget was approved, and this issue, coupled housing funding with housing regulatory reform, still coupled, has been put off for further deliberations and may go to the end of this month, may go to the middle of August. There are powerful, powerful forces against it, and there are some struggling and happy forces for it, and we'll see how it plays. But Denise, you're in the driver's seat with a lot of these discussions. Your handicap?
Like I said,
I need to praise you too. She was up there on an accessory dwelling unit bill, the Wachowski bill, when this came out, and it was like, oh my God, on behalf of Bay Area Council, and was the only person who actually stood up with unqualified support the day it was issued. And a lot of business groups have since supported, but that was a bold and right move, and she's getting some blowback from it, as you can imagine.
yeah. So like I said when I did the presentation, I began my career as a city planner. I did that for a decade. I ended my government career as essentially the planning director in a county planning department where I had purview over code enforcement, zoning, housing, redevelopment. And I managed all those employees. I abated second units. I managed new development projects and new housing projects. And so I'm intimately acquainted with all the ways to stop everything all the time. And in fact, that was actually the goal of the particular, lots of jurisdictions are working very hard to support housing. This is not a dump on the local governments kind of an issue, but there are many, many who are not, where the politics make it impossible if you want to have a political future to vote regularly for controversial housing projects. So part of why I joined a local zoning adjustments board is because I want to be helpful in improving housing in my community. And my years of professional experience give me a way of understanding the issues and framing them for neighbors who really don't want these projects to move forward. But every 2 weeks when we have an infill building in front of my zoning adjustments board, I get people, neighbors, 20, 30, 50 neighbors saying that building should be half as tall and have twice as many parking spaces and less traffic. And frequently, they're a block from BART. They're on 2 bus lines. They're in areas with nondescript, often industrial architecture. So, and they're all areas where the community did decades-long plans to support housing being developed in these locations. So builder comes in, applies for a permit, and spends another 5 years on knee pads, begging the neighbors, trying to make changes, cutting the density in half, whatever it takes to get to the approval. And then often, not always, but often as a thank you for that trouble, they get sued in CEQA and the whole project caves. As long as that's our housing production system in California, as long as housing production is boutique, hard to do, and relies on the intestinal fortitude and a kind of regional mindset of individuals on local planning and local city councils who are willing to take a lot of heat from their neighbors and maybe end their political career right out of the gates, we will not build enough housing in California. And so the Bay Area Council came out last fall with the Regional Resiliency Plan, and we said, there's going to have to be some kind of by right zoning in California to solve this problem. Housing projects, after we've planned and zoned and did CEQA and found the housing sites and put them in the general plan and held public hearings, after 5 or 10 years of planning, it's time to build. And if after 5 or 10 years of planning, it's time to plan for another 5 years, we will never build enough. And that's how we got in the mess that we're in now. So I don't know what will happen with the governor's by right. I hope that it is salvaged in a way that is actually useful for builders. It would be a radical change in the way we do land use. It would actually allow housing to be built. Virtually every major business organization in California has come out on the side of the governor. Bay Area Council, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, Southern California Leadership Group, including 3 prior governors, Biz LA, San Diego Business Councils, virtually every producer of housing in the state of California, nonprofits and for-profits, equity groups who advocate on behalf of the people who get affordable housing, enterprise community funds, NPH, Bridge Housing, Mercy Housing, Mid-Penn Housing, all of those folks have sided with the governor, probably for the first time ever on any major policy issue involving housing. Typically, they're fighting the governor. But none of those groups have been historically politically active in Sacramento. None of those groups write checks for $250,000 to candidates who run for the state legislature. Building Trades does. None of them have a slate card that they can send out in an assembly or a Senate race that says Sierra Club endorses, and have people take that card to the polls and vote the way the Sierra Club recommends, because we trust our environmental leaders to lead us to the best possible place for California. And so that's why when we started working on second units, we created this incredibly broad coalition to say, hey, we're out here, guys, and we're dying out here. We need more housing, and we need our leaders to lead. And it's going to be hard, and it's going to be painful, and lots of oxes will be gored. Lots of sacred cows will be served up. But if you don't, then you got to get comfortable with the status quo. And the status quo is people driving to work from Lodi who have jobs in San Francisco, teachers who cannot live in the communities where they work, nurses who put their kids in daycare at 5 and 6 in the morning in Vallejo and get on a bus and take that bus 2 hours away. That's the status quo right now. And that's not going to get any better unless there's a major recession and California loses hundreds of thousands of jobs. Under that scenario, yeah, sure, housing will be more affordable, but I don't think that's the California we want. So I am hoping that our leaders find a way forward with the governor's buy right, because I think it's a unique moment in time, and we are in a crisis, and crisis requires brave and visionary leadership.
So I guess I would take that as a yes. There's support, at least up here, for the governor's proposal.
Yeah, for what that's worth.
So maybe switching gears a little bit, I'm intrigued, and there's a couple of questions here about if anybody that you're aware of has really put thought into what to do about Prop 13 and this economic disincentive to approving housing in communities versus, some of these other challenges going down the housing element side.
So one of the tough parts of that story is California is still among the highest taxed states. It's just that we no longer let local government keep the money. And unraveling that particular snarl is challenging, but continuously asking voters to approve additional taxes for what I think many people think they're already paying taxes for is hard. That being said, bond measures and stuff did a pretty good job this last Tuesday in moving forward. One of the number one attractive bond measures, of course, is transportation improvements, because we haven't talked about the whole transportation network situation. But the governor's office has proposed to expand CEQA to make the creation of a new vehicle mile of capacity, even an HOV lane, a new CEQA impact, which is definitionally and legally a bad thing. So they're looking to put us on a, quote, road diet and not do roads anymore using CEQA, which would make people crazy if they lived in the sort of world of nerds that I live in, and it looks like we've maybe derailed that for a little bit. But there's a big ideological dispute about transportation funding.
I'm going to jump in on the Prop 13 bit. If you think by right zoning is hard, just try to change Prop 13. I think, to be intellectually honest, you have to put it out there as a problem. And I think that cities are being asked to, they're being given the big cram down. Do this, do that, but we're not going to give you any money, and you got to do more with less. I mean, that's part of the reality of the new world we live in. But it's also it's the institutions and the tax code is set up to be kind of inherently unfair and to provide a disincentive to doing the one thing that we all think we need to do. So I think you got to be putting that out there, and I don't know what the solution is about one. But that will be left for another day and probably another governor.
Another decade. So, all right, so Jennifer, you had raised questions about CEQA reform and you've tilted against that at that windmill for a long time, and there's an inquiry, and I've heard this asked by others as well, but there's an inquiry here that I think is interesting, and that is the question of whether or not you can bypass our state legislature, which is beholden to these groups, and go to the ballot, and could you ever envision selling a statewide initiative that would reform CEQA and bypass Sacramento's gridlock?
So the polling that has been done on this very topic has shown strong support for the environment by Californians, and a very high likelihood that an election like that would be decided on the question of who's on what side. So if you have the Sierra Club and the major environmental groups and trades on one side, and I know we have several refineries here, I've got family members in the refinery business too, but refineries or oil companies or even just businesses, there's an anti-business sort of thing going on here, that people would just vote based on who they thought was more trustworthy, and the vote would be against CEQA reform.
I think that won't change either until cities can't hire teachers and the teachers start quitting and leaving the state. I think it's going to have to get worse for real people in real communities before there's a sufficient motivation for the average person to decide that maybe they need to think differently about this issue. And I think it goes back to infill is uncomfortable. So on an emotional level, it doesn't matter how you pitch it or what you say, it's uncomfortable. And people don't really want it next to them. You, Andrew, said you scratch a NIMBY, or, scratch anybody who lives in California now and owns their own home, and you find a NIMBY without scratching too hard.
But there is this very cool group, they're YIMBYs, yes in my backyard people, they're millennials. And we shouldn't forget that the young are not as jaded as the old, and they're just flabbergasted at the idea that the Sierra Club in San Francisco is more focused on the view out somebody's bathroom window than on climate change. And there was a very strong effort by these kids, who of course extend into their 30s, to take over the local Sierra Club chapter, which is something that happened in Seattle and changed the nature of the advocacy work the group was doing. In San Francisco, they were run out of town on a rail, but they didn't go because they're on bikes and they're very agile. And so,
Yeah.
and so they're coming back.
They're
Because this
still there.
generation is totally screwed between student debt, no real kind of steady jobs. They do gig economy stuff, incredibly high costs. They're like, you people have not been acting for the environment. My favorite criticism of the book came from a woman in Oakland in her late 20s who was like, this is a law firm that makes its living on CEQA. They're not requiring real reform. And of course, we've been just pilloried on the other side. So don't forget the youth vote.
Yeah, and I actually think, they're starting their own political party. They're calling it the YIMBY Party. If we can have a Tea Party, why not a YIMBY Party? I think that kind of grassroots frustration and activism that frankly led to Prop 13 is really the only way this is going to change. And as we're sort of winding down the panel, what that tells me is that really everyone in this room is going to have to get busy on this issue in whatever way you think is appropriate, whether that's calling your legislator or being on your local zoning board. It's going to take all of us deciding to live differently and to have government be more responsive to create the kind of California we want to live in.
And there's another group too. So we had a gathering, actually Denise came at my house. There's a really incredible group of civil rights advocates that is still with us. They're mostly over 70. They fought against redlining, they fought discrimination. The head of the Latino caucus, the founder of the Latino caucus, the founder of greenlining. These are warriors, and they take no prisoners. And we had them together with the YIMBYs. And it was hilarious. The YIMBYs were like, well, where's their website? And the old guys were like, well, where do you meet? And they were like, meet? And, but that's a coalition, right? And then from there, what about the faith-based groups? We were talking to transportation advocates who've been advocating for years for more bus service in the inner ring of the Bay Area, where now displacement has overwhelmingly moved poorer people out to the burbs. And the churches have been the leading edge of that movement. Once the congregation moves, the church moves. And you know what? Now it's Antioch, right? And what does Antioch need? A lot better BART service. And so things are changing in the equity community and the church-based community. Look, everyone in this room is connected to some of this. Think about connecting people together on these issues. It is not business versus enviros. It is not the environment, and it's not sprawl. It's the quality of our lives and the lives of our children.
Well said. One of the abiding debates that gets thrown at home builders and is a tool of local government to make housing more expensive, but all, of course, in good faith, is saying if you build housing, market rate housing, housing that is just affordable to whoever can show up, you are creating the need for affordable housing. You, as the creator of housing, are also the cause of the need for affordable housing. It's your fault, basically. As the home builder, it's your fault, and you're going to have to pay the impact of building that of building that market rate house. And so we talk about inclusionary, and we talk about driving up the cost of market rate housing so that it will subsidize these houses. And that's become somewhat inured in California law, and it's survived Supreme Court challenge, which was really disappointing to those of us who thought we understood the Constitution, but we'll leave that for another day. You know, another quote-unquote solution that I've heard bandied about out there that I think would be particularly frightening for a group like ours is this notion of a job tax. That if it's not the housing creator, it's not the producer of the house that's causing the problem, it's the evil job creators. Because the job creators who create this wonderful job also have this concentric circle of lower wage jobs that have to serve that high wage individual who's going to be able to afford the market rate house. And it's the job creator that ought to be paying a tax to subsidize the construction of affordable housing for everyone else. And I mean, is that?
So to me, that gets you back to tax policy. Okay, we have to tax housing to have more of what we need from housing. And oh, by the way, we should tax jobs too, so we have more money to do what we need to do. Isn't that why we have a tax code? We have a tax because government wants to pay for public goods that the private market can't pay for. So these sort of extra taxes, like on-site inclusionary or fees, or housing development is the favorite thing to charge fees to. And every city in most of Northern California received a document about that thick in the last 12 months that allows them to charge these in lieu fees. They're called in lieu studies or
Nexus studies.
That provide that legal rationale. So you're a decision maker. I'm a housing developer. I understand the economic side, but you're a decision maker and you're a public policy person. You get this big fat report from an economist that says market rate housing is the culprit. Oh my God. Not only is it gentrifying my neighborhood, but they're the reason we have a housing shortage, because market rate housing isn't building enough affordable housing to solve the problem that market rate housing has created. So let's charge market rate housing more money, and then we'll get more affordable housing, which completely ignores the job side, except for those who take the next extension and they go off to the job. So basically what we're saying is our tax code is broken, and the only resort the local governments have is to tax the newcomer. The newcomer, new jobs, new housing, the person who doesn't own a house yet, because the people who already own a house that has a Prop 13 value from 30 or 40 years ago are paying a property tax that's less than on a housing value that's significantly less than its market value and far less than what the neighbors are paying. And so those are all examples of why we need to really look at the tax issues. And yeah, they're feeing housing, which is discouraging it from happening in many communities with well-intentioned and good reasons. And I spend a lot of my time during my day job explaining to people why market rate development can't, whether it's housing or office, cannot continue to pay extra fees to solve all of the problems of affordability and displacement and capital improvements and transportation and other things that are typically public goods that government pays for.
Well, let me bring it to the environmental policy thing, too. I mean, when we lost the Tesla battery factory, which wanted and got a lot of tax credits, right, from Nevada finally as the winning bidder, every job that happens in Nevada instead of California has a 3 times per person multiplier of greenhouse gas. So here it is, we've created this technology, we've birthed it, we've financed it. Now it's time for some high-wage jobs to be created. We're sending it to a place with 3 times more per capita GHG. And that's not just for the jobs, that's for each household. So if you think each job has 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 additional people associated with it, we've wiped out our greenhouse gas reductions in the state and just moved them to another state with higher GHG. Texas is even worse in terms of a per capita GHG number. So there's an environmental imperative to keep people here, to keep jobs here, and frankly to subsidize, if we need to keep them here, jobs.
Yeah, and jobs are the easiest thing to leave. Companies have budgets. If they have to pay too much in taxes or job linkage fees and their employees can't have housing, they can walk with they vote with their feet. Someone told me recently that a very large, prominent California company that's been here for 50 years has solved the housing problem for their employees. They moved to Austin.
Right.
And many of the California luminary companies are solving their housing problem the same way. They come to Northern California where they recruit young millennials who want to live in the Bay Area, and they train them up, and they get them into the door, and then when they reach household formation years, they move them out. And so they are moving out whole divisions of tech workers that make a good middle-class living, paying them their California base pay, and they move them to Texas and Portland and Seattle, and it's like getting a 30% pay raise, and the company doesn't. So the company keeps their employees really happy, and the employees have a much better quality of life, and they can buy a house and send their kids to a good school. So essentially, the California dream, the dream of the Golden State is becoming either for the golden, the ones who have a lot of money and can pay to have that golden lifestyle, or people who are in their golden years and already own their house. And that's no way to run the world's 8th largest economy, and yet that's what we're doing.
I'm curious, Denise, I've heard you talk about this once before, and especially in pairing it with the accessory dwelling unit issue of this notion of trying to do gentle infill, or what's called invisible infill, although I think that woman felt you sit in her lap, so it's not entirely imperceptible, but it is gentle. Is the notion of changing the way we build houses, especially these sort of accessory dwelling units, to some kind of prefab, factory-built structure that lowers that cost? Because that is one of those costs, and labor doesn't like to talk about it, but the cost of building, just the physical act of constructing a home in California has gone up by numbers that are just startling. And I wonder, what's your take right now on the feasibility of that at least being a contributing factor to bringing the cost down for certain types of housing?
I think if we're serious about building enough affordable housing, it's an all of the above answer, which includes manufactured housing. It's such a big problem, it's so pervasive that you can't just pick one policy initiative and say, oh, if we just did that one thing, it would fix the problem. Because the solution has been 40 years in the making. It's very complicated, and among the problems is the cost problem. The drivers of the cost problem are all cost centers. Code requirements. California is the highest building code standards, highest environmental standards, highest green standards, highest Title 24 of any state in the US. We have seismic issues, so we have a whole earthquake code that's different. So each time you make a change, water conservation measures, every time you add something new to the building code that makes it more expensive to build in California, it's more expensive to build a home in California. So obviously looking for ways of managing that cost is really important. One thing you see in the market today is builders are just, my housing budget is this big. That's all I got to spend on rent or sale, and it doesn't get any bigger because incomes rise more slowly than cost. That's all I got. So what happens? The house shrinks. Because I still only have, say, my $3,000 a month housing budget, or $2,000 or whatever it is. If I can't buy a 1,500 square foot home for my housing budget, then I'll buy a box in my neighbor's dining room, or whatever I can afford. So unit compression has already happened. Market rate apartments have gone from, on average, 1,200 square feet to, on average, 500 square feet, right? They're half the size. And meanwhile, prices keep going up. So then the next thing you look through is construction type. As I was running quickly through the solutions, cities can encourage more cost-effective construction types. So what do I mean? Wood frame buildings, things that don't involve steel and concrete, which are expensive and have to be brought in on ships from China mostly. Tiny houses, second units.
Less parking.
Things that have less parking, less podium parking, less parking period. Luckily, technology is helping. Things like Uber and Lyft. There is now an app where you can dial up the SUV to go to Tahoe, and they'll deliver it to your house, and you drive it up there, and then you drive it back home, and they pick it up and take it back. So there are technological solutions that will allow increasingly infill builders to build less parking. I know parking is always a problem. Neighbors always want more. City councils typically want more. Builders want to do just enough, but not too much. So I think some of that will help. The problem right now with manufactured housing is it's like any other industry in its infancy. It's just not ready for prime time. And perhaps over the next 5 to 10 years, there'll be a big enough, a robust enough housing pipeline that manufactured, maybe a factory that would build housing in California, where the factory jobs could be union jobs, but you're still producing a unit for $200,000 a unit instead of $500,000 a unit. That could become a reality. But today, there's growing pains in that industry, so it's not going to solve the problem, anytime soon.
All right, I wanted to, I didn't want to leave without at least touching on one more set of alphabet soup issues as an alternative to the governor's by right proposal, or not as an alternative, but maybe as the next step. There's a process in California. The Housing and Community Development Department looks over your housing element and your regional housing allocation, your regional housing need allocation. And do you see, maybe this is more for Jennifer, this is maybe lawyer nerd to lawyer nerd, but is there an opportunity in our planning and zoning law to really put some teeth behind the notion of, if you're gonna plan for housing and you're gonna say on your books that you've got this area zoned, that you're actually gonna be held to it?
I just don't see it. I mean, you're in Lafayette. I'm not going to give you that affordable housing dollars that I actually don't have in the state budget. You know,
It's a false threat.
There's a hammer, right? It's like, hurt me some more. And in fact, I think that we've already seen cities that have more density get effectively penalized, because then they have a higher number of affordable and other units that they're supposed to produce. One of the most perverse things we saw in this last week or so, as the governor's right proposal came out, was the Planning and Conservation League, which proposed that this by right proposal only apply in locations that already have 5,000 people per square mile. And that is a level of density that, yeah, is in Oakland and San Francisco. It is sure as heck not in San Diego, Sacramento, San Jose, any of the East Bay suburbs, including Berkeley. I mean, really? So the idea of taking Tony suburbs and letting them off the hook, you know, is just not there. And at the same time, we don't have any tools on the books now that really compel production in those communities.
All right, well, I would like to thank the three of you for a very interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
I'm not even a lawyer.
Yeah, you're like, and by the way,
And I'd like to turn it back over to our Kristen for some closing remarks.
Sure. No, which will be brief, because we always end on time.
Right.
So I knew this would be awesome, and all of my expectations were exceeded. So really, I would just thank you. You're amazing. There's actually someone even proposed marriage to you, Jennifer, in the back. So I'm just saying. So that was great. You know, it is summertime. We're not gonna have any events as the council until September 16th, where we'll finish the East Bay Leadership Series with a focus on the workplace of the future and millennials and how workspaces and places are changing. So we'll hope you join you for that. Hope you will join us for that. And we also have our annual Philanthropy Awards on November 3rd, which is our just one of my favorite days of the year. So we'll hope you'll mark your calendars for that. But thank you to all of our sponsors. Thank you for coming, and perhaps maybe some of these very smart women will be sticking around for some questions. So thank you very much. Have a great day.